All right, so I have 104, so I'm going to do that. And we have 21 people on there. I don't know if everybody's put their name in the list, but I think we have a good smattering of people. I figured this first meeting would probably be Red Hat heavy, just in light of what we're talking about today. But we really welcome and hope that all of you who are non-Red Hatters will speak up and participate actively in this conversation, because that's why we're doing this. And we really need you and your voices. So I'm just going to keep saying that. And I was hoping to see Danny Kamiya rather. Is he here?
I'm here. Yeah, I'm
All
here.
right. Perfect.
Yeah,
Dan?
I'm driving at the same time, so yeah. But I'm
Okay.
here.
Don't have an accident, but we.
I'm good. I'm good.
All right.
I'm good. Cheers.
So, Danny, I just was going to call you out first in sort of the welcome and get the meeting started. And let me see if I hit the record button, because I'm really actually, I did hit the record button. So this meeting is being recorded, and I will post the video with the link in the notes to the Google group, and the video will be up on YouTube under the OpenShift. Maybe I'll start another playlist for OKD4 related things, or OKD related things. So Clayton's here now. Great. See, Clayton, I just hung out until you did. So there. But I really wanted to call out Danny for helping really get some visibility on this and kick off the survey, which I'll save sort of as a last thing to go through some of the survey stuff, because a lot of the survey that we just put out, which 52 people responded to, a lot of it, from my point of view, was about logistics for meetings and who was interested in discussing this OKD design and roadmap and the current thinking, and not only just interested in discussing it, but who was interested in working on it and contributing to it. So thank you, Danny, for that, and don't have a car accident. But we're grateful for that. So I also wanted to ask Ben Howard just to introduce himself, because he sort of volunteered to help drive this too, and he's from the engineering team. So Ben, if you want to just quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Ben Howard. I'm currently a member of the Red Hat CoreOS team, and just have a background in deployment of operating systems to the cloud. I'm new to this effort, but excited to help out and see where this will go.
Cool. And that was really one of the key things for me, is so that I tend to chair most of the SIG groups that are under OpenShift Commons, but I really wanted to have some of the more technical people incorporated into driving the working group. And I don't know if you can see my screen right here, but Sanja Bonek, I think that's how you say your name, Sanja. Is it Sanja?
Yeah, Sanja Bonek, that's how I say it always, usually, yeah.
Okay. So Ben works for Sanja, or works with Sanja. I'm not sure the total hierarchy of things here. And so thank you for volunteering Ben that he was going to do this. So great. Also, I'm going to say that I don't actually have all the visibility of the chat. So if it's something, Sanja is my boss. Good. I got that right. One of the things that we've been working on in the background is coming up with an OKD working group charter. And I will insert the link to this here, but basically what we've done is looked at what's the current mode in the Kubernetes world for SIG groups. I've made a distinction between the using the word working group, because I like you guys to do some work, versus SIG groups, which is the nomenclature that I use in OpenShift Commons for topic-specific things rather than SIGs. And I know SIGs is what we use in the Kubernetes space, but for OpenShift, I'd already claimed that for something else that was more about best practices and sharing workload and guidance sort of things, rather than doing technical work. So if you'll bear with me, we're okay with that. And I'm just going to pop and make sure no one's objecting to doing that please put you on the list. If someone could put Michael Kopje on the list, that would be great. And I know that BlueJeans isn't the perfect device, so we may move to something else like Zoom or something like that that's more industry standard rather than Red Hat specific eventually. But this really is what I was hoping that for an introduction to this working group is that we are here to discuss, give guidance, enable collaboration, and to maybe not enable, but to collaborate together on the development efforts for OKD4, for Fedora CoreOS, and there's more of that to come in the later agenda too, why that's important. And if you didn't see the briefing we did a couple of weeks ago on that, I will insert the link to that to watch because there was a very good update. Benjamin Gilbert, who's on the call, did a great talk explaining the relationship, what Fedora CoreOS is and the relationship to OKD4 integration needs. And it's really about creating a space for you to produce working group materials, best practices, guidance, and all of that stuff, but also to figure out some work. And I didn't get much further than that. And you'll see links in here to old CNCF stuff that we need to figure out where to link to. So Sonia and Ben, I'm hoping that we can continue to work on this. And if Sonia, you want to say any 2 words, or Ben, about this topic, that would be great.
I'm totally letting Ben talk.
Okay, I'm letting you let Ben.
Yeah, I'm still taking a look at things there, so I don't have much content to add here, but I'll backfill this later.
Okay, so I will. I think right now this document is not in it's not in my public drive, so I have to move it over, and I'll do that today after this meeting and put a new updated URL in there now. So and I'm going to add Benjamin's name here to this. So that's really what I wanted to say is I think this group needs an official charter, needs to be an official working group, because I think there are things I believe, and I think everybody else on the call hopefully believes too, that we're going to do work and we're going to have to make decisions about directions and things, and there will be things we need to vote about and set that stage. So having something in place and making it a little bit more formal than the SIGs is my intention with that. Anybody have any more words about that or any more thoughts, or anyone want to volunteer to help work on that? It will be available for people to give feedback on and comment on publicly. And we'll probably put it up in a repo too, once we get a first good draft of it on GitHub.
Yeah, I will help out Ben. I will reach out to him.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Your name has, you can't see it because you're driving, but I just put your name on that, Danny.
Yeah, all right, cheers.
All right, so the next bit of this, Clayton is here. I want to use his time wisely. We've had a couple of good discussions already about OKD4 design and roadmap, but Clayton, if you could bring us up to speed a little bit here and take a few minutes and talk about the current thinking and the proposed strategy and how we discuss how we can set some short and medium strategy checkpoints. I really appreciate that.
Sure. So I assume a lot of folks on this are familiar with the discussions on the mailing list. If I were to briefly summarize where we are, I made an initial proposal around a quote-unquote philosophy for OKD4, continuously updating, continuously secure Kubernetes distribution. In that model, it would inherit a lot of the things that make OpenShift 4 easy to manage, easy to use, easy to operationalize by taking some choices away. There was a number of good discussions in the mailing list, folks talking about operating systems and what other choices we might have, folks who wanted potentially to run on architectures or platforms that may not be necessarily in the Fedora CoreOS execution path. Also, a couple of discussions around wanting flexibility. I think those are the kind of the two major, core approaches. Something that's flexible and can be used to help build out things that are a little bit more opinionated from a user perspective, versus something that allows an open source ecosystem, participant to mix and match or to change up, to have a little bit more flexibility. There was a bunch of good points there. I feel like a good next step, maybe for the working group in general, would be to summarize those concisely and to fit those into a trade-offs and choices doc that folks could act on. Certainly right now, the path of least resistance for, getting the basic idea of something running that takes a lot of the work that's been done for OpenShift 4 into OKD 4 would be, proceeding down the Fedora CoreOS discussion. I know there'll be some follow-up on that, but it does not mean in any sense that we are locked into that approach. The survey hopefully generated some good data around what people are looking for, and I think we want to leave open and really gather from consumers, contributors, and visionaries in the community if there are different directions that we're not considering between those two. It's entirely possible that some of the tools that we would think of as part of OKD4 are actually pieces that should be, that can satisfy those goals, maybe split out. So there's a number of components that make up OpenShift, and so it's not as if all of our agreements have to happen in this form. We could certainly break that down into smaller pieces and spin off some working groups for that. So at this point, I feel like a good next step is the stating kind of a couple of proposed approaches. And I didn't hear a ton of concern about, in the short term, taking advantage of the head start that OCP4 has already created down the particular opinionated path and exploring that while we have some of those discussions about how much extra flexibility we would like to add.
So are there people on the call now that have things that they'd like to add to that?
I would just add one. I mean, I already made my point on the mailing list. I totally agree with Clayton. My view is that as a phase one or baby steps or whatever, but we should just crack on with exactly what has been said on OKD plus FCOS to mimic exactly what OCP4 is. Yes, all the other stuff are all welcome, but at least let's have something out ready for OKD rather than just boiling the ocean. That is my view anyway.
Yeah, so, I concur with that because I think it's probably the shortest path to get there.
And who was that just speaking? Sorry, I didn't.
Ben Howard.
Ben Howard. All right. Cool.
Hello. One of the things that I'm generally concerned of with the way that OKD4 has, for the lack of shaping up, is something that I don't want to see continue, which is that we've kind of lagged super far behind OCP, and that has also been something that's happened in 3X for a fair bit of time, and that has made it very difficult to sort of make sure that things are going to be working and stuff like that. Traditionally, with most of the other stuff that Red Hat ships, it is dev, community, then product, and the loop being inverted means that it makes it very difficult for that to get those things kind of shaken out properly. And another thing that I'm concerned about from my efforts within the Fedora project is that most of the container orchestration components and the container engine components are rotting because we don't have anything to use it with. The version of OpenShift and Kubernetes, upstream vanilla Kubernetes, both of those are usually updated in lockstep together, but they haven't been updated for a while, and it makes it so all the things like shipping cryo and things like that are not useful because there's no way to actually appropriately test them. I think right now we have no version of CRI-O that works with any version of Origin/OKD that's or Kubernetes in Fedora. So we don't know what the point is of having all of that. It'd be nice to start seeing OKD code and packaging stuff kind of landing in Fedora more directly so that we can do these things properly and make sure that that stuff is working and usable. Because right now it all isn't.
That's actually a really interesting point, Neil. I feel like OKD was more CentOS focused rather than Fedora, and the development cycle of OKD was on the Cube schedule, not on the Fedora schedule. I certainly think that there's a good discussion to be had on the strategy side about what the release cycle is. I know that the team sets a very, the folks working on OpenShift in general today set a very aggressive schedule that is on the OpenShift schedule, not anybody else's. Do you think Fedora is the right schedule, or are you more talking about the Fedora process rather than Fedora schedule?
So there's two aspects to this. So one is that the Fedora process is generally there's components that that OpenShift, Kubernetes, and things like that rely on that come from the Fedora side. And a lot of times you guys are kind of kneecapped from being able to take advantage of it because you've been following CentOS almost strictly. And this is a good opportunity to change that. That part is true. The release cadence of OpenShift versus Fedora, I think, is actually going to be less of a concern now than it was in the past, because we do have this, for lack of something better to call it, the modularity thing, which RHEL 8 has with AppStream, that would allow us to release those things at the kind of cadence that you guys have typically done, which I think is quarterly. But it would be nice to see, like, we would have the default version of OKD shipping in a non-modular context for just whatever. Anyway, shipping the default version of OKD moving forward in the Fedora release process, but also shipping the other versions is possible with the modularity stuff that's been going on in Fedora. And I think, and one of the things that will make sense with that is that we currently have CRI-O modularized. And so tying the CRI-O module to the Kubernetes or OpenShift module means that we can get that dependency relationship matched. So, for example, OCP 311, or OKD 311 map to CRI-O 111, and Kubernetes 111 maps to CRI-O 111. So basically, if you pick OKD or Kubernetes, you still match with the correct CRI-O. And then going forward with newer versions of OKD, with the 4X series, we can map those correctly and make sure that people don't do dumb things like mismatch CRI-O with mismatched OKD and break your entire system.
And actually, I think I think there's like two things to unpack here. One is components in Fedora that integrate with Cube, like CRI-O. It might be that it's time to say, the CRI-O of this version this Fedora is intended to work with this version of Cube. I would say there's an interesting second point, which is I actually almost think that what you described is the exact opposite of how we think about OpenShift, which is the operating system is just a component. And so the difference between Fedora 30, 31, 32, 33, 34 is a choice the platform makes about it rather than vice versa. And some of those choices are modularity actually isn't important to us because we already have a modularity approach. In packaging, maybe. In release lifecycle, no. Like some of the mindset in OKD and OpenShift is starting to be making an opinionated choices about what parts of the operating to consume and controlling that very deeply. I don't know if that's in conflict with the Fedora approach, but it's actually, I think that's a discussion topic that we need to queue up in a strategy discussion, which is I almost might characterize what we're trying to do as the exact opposite of that, is not expect Fedora to tell that, but us to dictate to the version of the operating system packaged together how that works. Since historically, at least, CRI-O development is driven by the OpenShift goals and the Kubernetes team goals rather than vice versa.
Well, so that's why I pointed out the modularity thing and where the Fedora release cadence doesn't really matter as much because those are being handled independently and being pushed to all Fedora releases no matter what. So they're following the Kubernetes cadence rather than the Fedora one. And so from my perspective, I don't think it matters that much what the Fedora release guidance is and stuff like that. What I'm more concerned about is that all those things are functionally useless to ship if we can't use them. Like right now, nobody's having a working OKD or a working Kubernetes that works in Fedora. And at this time, we're the only major distribution that doesn't have one that works. And that is, to some extent, kind of embarrassing because we have OpenShift. And to another part of it is, what the hell is going on? Is like, why are we shipping Kubernetes components that don't work? And I start wondering more existentially, does it even make sense to involve Fedora at all if you guys don't care? So if you guys don't care, then what should we be doing? And I'm not saying that that's what we should just rip Fedora out of this whole equation. I actually personally would like to see like Fedora CoreOS be more central to this, but we've got to have the point where people in Fedora land have to be able to use this stuff. And you're shipping stuff that nobody can verify whether it works or not. So that's my fundamental problem.
Okay, and I think so then I took some notes as well on that. I think the other question that I heard in that last one is OKD thinks of itself as a distribution and Fedora thinks of itself as a distribution. So we actually are in somewhat conflict in terms of philosophy and how do we reconcile that, right? Like OKD, many of the tools in OKD, and we talked about this in the threads, were designed to be able to create a new distribution concept that's above and beyond an OS concept, but much of the content in those comes from what we consider distributions as well, and so we need to reconcile that. So that is a definite thing that we have to close in a subsequent discussion.
Clayton, do I understand correctly that you're suggesting that both OKD and OpenShift itself should treat the operating system as part of the larger platform, whether it be OpenShift or OKD?
I think this is kind of that trade-off that discussed in the thread is I think you could argue that OKD is the first real attempt to create a new type of distro, not an OS distro, but a cluster OS distro. And there are elements of that where there's huge overlap between, building and shipping software in Fedora, testing that it all works together and verifying it. But then that also has to be combined with all of the software on top of it, much of which may or may not be coming from Fedora, in a traditional sense. And so I think that's basically an open question: is do we want to be a distro in OKD and create the new cluster OS distro, or do we want to subsume some of those pieces into maybe the more traditional Fedora cycle?
I mean, so to be absolutely clear here, I am not talking about making OKD follow Fedora's release cycle. That none of what I'm talking about involves that at all, because already right now Fedora CoreOS operates basically on its own, whatever the hell update cycle it is. It's every 2 weeks or whatever. And within the dist-git and the process model and things like that, things can life cycle more or less independently if they want to. The fact that it's 29 or 30 or 31 is more or less irrelevant. That is not part of this that I'm concerned about. And I would personally like to see Fedora be a supported base for OKD, because that's newer stuff, better tech, things like that. But it's still an open question of how in the world do the components that OKD will rely on will actually be able to be validated so that they're not broken before OKD relies on them in production systems, right? Because we don't have a Kubernetes package that works, and we don't have an OKD system that works within the Fedora sources secure environment that we can actually use to bootstrap and test and validate these things. There's a Fedora CI system that is in process of being developed and used. I would like to see us take advantage of that. and things like that, so that we actually are a premier platform, not only for using OKD, but also to be able to ship these components that make containers great for having your production applications and services on them.
Okay, so Alex, did that answer your question? Maybe we definitely, this is, I think, this has surfaced not just the fundamental question, but a bunch of variants on how we execute. Alex, did that answer your question, or?
It does, and maybe this isn't the right time, but I would like to challenge the idea that OKD is going to be a cluster distribution. I'm personally in preference of kind of a layered approach where the operating system is actually distinct from the cluster, which is very different from the approach we've taken. But I can save that argument for the right time.
Okay, so
let's say we have to make a choice. Like that choice informs a lot of technical work, especially around the machine config operator and things like that. So we can't just decide that later exactly. I mean, I feel like
later might be soon, just not like, I think, we're maybe like based on what we said previously, like, Danny's point about trying to make some concrete progress now in the same vein that we're going, while not unduly deferring this question, because you're right, Colin, it is a big one. So maybe there's a follow-up specific session. Maybe we can do it via both doc and mailing list, and potentially a couple of meetings on identifying the fundamental trade-off questions, making arguments for or against, and building to a consensus on each of those. Then, Colin, if you guys can, it sounds like you got volunteered for that to at least frame the initial document. Is there anybody else who wants to be involved in that, or?
I'm going to make Clayton a review of that, and if I could, Colin, if I could work with you and Ben Howard to just sort of at least frame some of that, and then share that document with the group for further refinement. I think that would be helpful, because you mentioned something earlier I just want to go back to, and on this meeting, I'm really just a logistics person. I don't have a strong opinion. I have opinions, but I'm not going to make them strongly. The survey that we initially did was more logistics about meetings and whether you would be a resource for these discussions and collaborations. But I'd like to see the trade-off choices document developed and then perhaps turned into a bit of a survey on that, some of those questions that we have from that, and send it out to the group to get feedback on. If that's all right with Ben and Colin, and anyone else volunteering?
Maybe let's take that to the mailing list, or take that to a follow-up then.
Perfect. And then Sonia just saying, in the decision-making process, Sonia, Ben, and I are gonna try and work on that as part of the charter document.
So I put that in the charter, how I have seen it happen at the W3C and where it's worked, because there's a whole lot of global contributors who sometimes do not answer for ages, so they have a good process of dealing with that, which is what I've put in the decision process. In the charter doc, what I'd like to just say that, so once we have discussed on a way forward, that is that, or that's how I view it. And then if someone wants changes to that or is unhappy with anything of that, this is where we start decision process as outlined in the charter. So maybe we can just, it's probably not good to discuss it now because there's a bit of reading to do. But I have to do it now as well, so.
Yeah, Neil, we're looking, I mean, I know that I am personally CNCF centric. So yeah, we're definitely looking at, as Sanja noted, I'm just looking at the chat notes here. We are gonna pull in Fedora people to this because we know there's a lot of Fedora folks on this too, so yeah.
It gets super weird for me because I'm also involved in OpenSUSE Cubic, so this is how I feel like slightly sad that we don't have something like that within Fedora as well, under the Fedora umbrella or something like that.
No, Neil, this is going to be way better than that. You're good.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, then I will hold you to that.
It will. Trust me. I like streamlined processes, but I like them to be very open. So we'll be good. I have been one way too many.
Do we have list of something where we put the actual working group members?
We'll get to that in a minute. I will have a list of working group members from this meeting, and the last item, which I'll just jump to now, is I'm going to use Google Group, and there's a link there to the Google Group to join the working group. So if you click on there and join, you will be added to at least to the mailing list and all of that once we figure out the charter. Then there will be, some more officialness to being a member of the working group, but not very official. We really just want participation and external people working with us on this too. So please join that. So did we come to a bit of a closure there on the sort of design strategy and next step of creating the trade-off and choices? Because I'm just cognizant we're halfway through the meeting.
Dan, could I just add one comment here? This is Tim Dudgeon. I've got one concern, quite a big concern about this strategy, in that there is now going to be a very big divergence between OKD and the supported OCP product. And for me, as someone who's trying to roll out clusters to customers and support them, that's a really big problem, because before I even start, I've got to make a fork in the road and say, am I going down what will be the Fedora CoreOS route and then OKD, or am I going down the supported route on Red Hat CoreOS? And they're two completely different products with different behaviors and different bugs and different behaviors and all sorts of things. So from my point of view, of rolling out things to a customer, I'd like there to be much tighter convergence between the two. So I'd question whether we should be basing this on Fedora CoreOS at all, or whether it would be better to base it around Red Hat CoreOS, so we've got the same basic operating system. One is just a bit more upstream than the other.
Hey, Charo Groover here. I want to echo into that as an actual customer of Red Hat running OCP in production. Up through the 3.11 family, we've been running OKD, previously Origin, in a lab environment as a way to stay up to date on what's coming, and using it as a learning opportunity for my engineers to get familiar with what's going to be in the new product. And echo onto that, if the two ecosystems really are going to diverge as much as it sounds like they potentially could, I think that would be a detriment to Red Hat as well as the customers of Red Hat who are using the product in a similar fashion.
And, I actually kind of, I don't like to say this, but I kind of agree here too. Obviously using OCP in production is going to use RHEL CoreOS. And even though I personally would like, and I and a number of the members of my team would like to have latest and greatest technologies when we're using OKD, there's also the flip side of that. If we're also trying to use it in a production environment and we're using OCP and RHEL CoreOS isn't following Fedora CoreOS that closely, then there is a bit of a problem. Now, that being said, I have actually less to no clue about how RHEL CoreOS is being developed. It could be that it's just more closer to Fedora than RHEL Atomic was in the past. And if that's the case, then maybe this really doesn't matter. So this is more about to what extent is there a specific divergence between FCOS and RHCOS?
And Neil, you kind of set us up for the next topic.
Well,
so that's well done. So I'm going to add that in. And we have Colin and Benjamin Gilbert on this call. So maybe if we pause here and move into, what the OKD integration with FCOS means and what the divergence is between FCOS and RHEL can be something they address. Colin, Benjamin?
Sure, I'll dive into this. So, my name is Colin Walters. I work on the machine config operator, RCOS and FCOS. So very obviously interested in this. And what I would say is we are definitely spending a lot of time focused on the product. Fixing bugs in the machine config operator and RCOS and that stuff like that. I definitely want this to happen. I think what I really wanted to get to was kind of, there's definitely high-level strategy things, but I think we can get to a point where we have something booting. Like basically, if we take FCOS as it exists today, and then the HackMD doc I posted talks about how we kind of cross the ignition version hurdle, because differences between FCOS and RCOS include ignition spec 2 versus spec 3. Just the number one blocker to like kind of just getting anything booting, and it's going to require patches to the installer, the OpenShift installer. Probably it's going to require a translator between ignition spec 2 and 3. Anyways, the doc talks about it, and I know Christian Glombeck, Steve Green were some people who were probably going to look at some implementation on this. I'm trying to take like an architecture, watch over the architecture and things like that, and I'll definitely help out. But yeah, I think my executive summary is, I had a proposal in that doc for what we do. Now, Neil did bring up some interesting questions, like where do we get cryo from? And is it the same cryo as OpenShift, the product, or is it different? Is it built in Fedora infrastructure, or does it come out of API.ci? A lot of what Neil was talking about was sort of, I think he's kind of had the premise that OpenShift, the OS, would be something you yum install, whereas I'm coming more from the premise we start with something that's more Fedora CoreOS-like. And so, whether things are modules or not just doesn't matter too much. It's just an implementation detail, the build system, basically. That's my quick brain dump, I guess.
It's interesting, Colin. I think like the divergence question leads into the what are the choices that benefit stability for end users and a reasonable set of consistency, and what are the choices that allow flexibility where people want it, where people have the flexibility to go do what they want. And I feel like those are kind of an interesting tension. So there's people who would like to make choices that would probably be more what the classic flexibility of open source is. And so much of like the OpenShift 4 mindset is around taking away flexibility to offer that appliance-like model, that appliance-like mindset. Is the details are kind of supposed to be unimportant because it's supposed to just work. For each of the different questions, each of the different types of components, the OS, the things in the OS, the core operators, the operators on top, and the installer, maybe for each of those, there might be a subtly different discussion point that we have about maybe this is the one component that varies a little bit from OCP, or maybe this isn't. That, as we get into detail, I think we could probably have different answers for different components along those lines.
Hate to be a wildcat and throw some extra questions in, but in my communication with folks, there's a fair bit of confusion as to whether or not OKD is the bleeding edge, the platform from which you can try emerging technology before it finds its way into a commercial distribution, or is it something that will lag the commercial distributions and really is not a good test bed for getting to know the platform and its future directions?
So maybe I can take a quick moment to answer this, and I feel like this needs to go into one of the docs. So the OpenShift 4 philosophy, both for OCP and at least in theory for OKD, is that there's a number of existing upstreams, the Linux kernel, Kubernetes, a number of projects out there that are fairly stable that are consumed, and then a number of projects out there that are actively developed. For a lot of those components, the active developed ones are the ones that folks in the OpenShift community are actually working on. So operator lifecycle, the machine APIs, machine operators, those are being driven to satisfy the goal. So those are bleeding edge or leading edge. For a number of the other components, consumption of a kernel, picking a version of Kubernetes, those are more taking the stable versions, and the bleeding edge is itself in Kubernetes. Like if you want the latest Kubernetes, go to Kubernetes. I think that's been a point of tension and confusion, and maybe that's another discussion point for the strategy doc of kind of OCP as it is today, and in theory OKD are bleeding edge where they need to be to deliver value. leading edge where it has a lot of value, and stable for the things that are less critical to drive. My opinion is honestly the OS is the not least important, but we don't typically drive from it. And Kubernetes, everybody who contributes to Kubernetes, we definitely lead things 2 or 3 releases upstream, but the actual work is tying it all together. And there's so much work generated to stabilize some of those features that bleeding edge on those is just completely impractical for something like, anything that's as dependent on CRDs as OpenShift 4 is. Like, there was a ton of work that had to go into Kubernetes and then be backported because the rest of Kubernetes was unstable or too unstable. And so some of that tension, I think, is showing up here in each of the components we talk about.
Is the intention, though, or are we going to determine that OKD is at least upstream of OCP, and that if I want to preview or even to influence what the next iteration of OCP looks like, that I'm working in OKD rather than in one of the projects that is upstream of OKD, like Kubernetes itself?
So historically, OCP was developed like that. It caused a lot of problems. We did a lot of work to shorten the cycle between when we could take an upstream component, stabilize it, and ship it down to days or hours. And so I would say I could see OKD being a parallel, but I would say if we look at OKD as the upstream, there's no real desire for that from the OCP engineering side, because it just creates more work for those folks. I think they'd like to have the leading edge of their components in both OKD and OCP at the same time. We've certainly done a lot of work in OCP to make nightly. We're planning on having nightlies for 4.2 and 4.3 available well in advance of release for people to try things out. And that's not the whole, I don't think that's this community's strict requirement, but for some of strict interest. But certainly if your goal is to try OCP ahead of release, we will have other ways of doing that, which gives OKD a little bit more flexibility to be different from OCP if that's what people choose.
Thank you for that clarification. That makes sense.
All right. Driving right along. And I made just a note to myself. I'm apologizing in advance. I'm really bad at taking minutes. And there will be a video, and the video has some transcription, which is what I love about YouTube. So if you didn't catch all of that, and you obviously can see that I haven't caught it all in the minutes, it will be in the video, and you can re-listen to that. Do you want to take on the next topic, the overview of the state of release of tooling for OKD, Clayton?
Colin, was there anything you wanted to summarize? I mean, I know we only have a few minutes left, so if we want to come back and have a deep dive on maybe what you saw for number 4, Colin, we could dig into that.
Yeah, no, I think the doc covered. I mean, there's a lot in the implementation details that we need to get to, but that does seem like a separate time. So,
is the doc linked in the agenda? Can you link that?
Yeah, if you can. That's great. There was a little. I wanted to talk a little bit about Ignition, and also say that at the end of August we're going to have an OpenShift Commons briefing on Ignition. So if you're on the call and you don't know about Ignition, I think it's the 28th of August that you guys scheduled to give a full-on talk on it and dive into it. So just so you know, and I'll put the link in when I'll pop there, add link to briefing. And I know I can see there's a question. The biggest issue is whether we use spec 2 or 3, which may or may not mean something to anyone here, but it sounds like a longer conversation. And we can talk about that and how to incorporate that once people know what it is in a survey here. And whatever we come up with a charter for voting on it.
Okay.
So I see a few minutes. Go ahead.
So I can, just so folks kind of get an orientation of what CI is doing today and what the release process is. I wanted to show at least what it's doing today, just so we can orient. I know a lot of people haven't seen it. Let me share my screen. Tell me if folks can see this. Dan, I'm going to take over from you.
Yeah.
Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Great. So as part of that mindset of like shortening the ability to consume from upstream, there's a lot of work that happened in RHEL CoreOS that's in CoreOS, which this gets to like, where are you pulling from? What we've tried to do is kind of look at this as how do you compose things out of images? We're very opinionated about what's in those images as long as they're compatible. So if they're Ubuntu or Alpine or Scratch or Fedora or CentOS images, even though in practice we tend to be pretty diligent about being consistent across having one base image and all that, we're less opinionated about it, which is components are kind of the smallest artifact of deployment that we have as an image. And so some of the tooling and automation is about taking images that are loosely coupled and binding them into an overall release artifact. And that's based on operators. So an operator can say, hey, I want to be included in the release, and when I get deployed, I'm going to go do stuff. We have a bunch of tooling in the OpenShift space called the cluster version operator and OLM that hides some of the details of, I just want to get a controller installed into Kubernetes that goes and does the rest of the work. And so what we actually do is we stitch together a large number of images. And pick a slightly older version and compose them. So in a sense, like there's an analogy here to like OS composes, which is we take a bunch of fundamental components and their APIs need to be aligned, right? The kernel and glibc and LS and systemd all kind of need to be pretty close. We're combining that at kind of the higher level of operators. By doing that, we're really kind of saying we don't care about what's inside the image as long as it's compatible. We bundle them together, test them, and release them. So for everything in the current OCP release today, except for the OS content, it is fully open source content that exists out on the internet, and that content, we publish those to Quay. So let me dig in a little bit. So like this is just like a nightly that has everything except for a version of Red Hat CoreOS, which makes it a little bit difficult to install and use, and that's why the Fedora CoreOS was kind of seen as like a thing we would plug in and replace, and maybe a few of the pieces would change, but the vast majority wouldn't. We're kind of composing together a whole number of components, and this is just a changelog view, so I just wanted to illustrate, from any of these, this is a, looks like I'm not using the right version of the tool, so this is, just showing you what particular Git commit in the open source it is. This image is built and mirrored to Quay.io. So, this source code for this operator shows up at Quay.io in the OpenShift. When was this? That was operator. So today, we are publishing all of these images to Quay. They're rolling published, and what we're trying to just do is get the momentum going so that when we do get to an OKD, the point of having an OKD that actually works, the vast majority of the components are already being built. These are being built by CI when changes are merged to the release branches in the open source repos. So if you can see here, just as like a really basic, the master branch, these changes are made and then they show up in OpenShift OCP, and they show up in OpenShift origin in close proximity in the next version of OCP, but in the latest version of the images and all that. So what we're just trying to do is get the momentum going so that we can leverage a lot of what we have, and we can change anything we want in this process. But we wanted to at least ensure that people didn't feel like, in my mind, we could very quickly, or as quickly as is reasonably possible, integrate the Fedora CoreOS side and be able to have something we can point and look at and then iterate from there, maybe dramatically diverge, maybe rebuild the CI and infrastructure to be completely different. I think we'd have some choices. My hope had just been that we could reuse as much as possible that was built and published in an open source fashion so that people can iterate. And so, like, if I jump in to look at some of these images, I don't know if it's going to show me the metadata actually. some of the metadata you can actually see in here is, this Git commit was actually what I used to link to that website. And so it's like, we are publishing this content and it is OKD quote unquote ready. I'm sure we'll want to go in and iterate, but for the sake of, an initial stab, we are very close to having 90% of the stuff covered, and we need to close the last details before we have like a prototype phase 1 OKD. So I didn't want people to get the feeling that we aren't terribly close to having something that we can at least iterate on.
So Clayton, I have a quick question for you, if you don't mind. Once we address the elephant in the room with regards to the operating system, is it fair to assume that, let's say, if Fedora CoreOS will be the OS moving forward, is it fair to say that the current CI would be able to, or should be able to, kind of build the image for the Fedora CoreOS in the same way it does for the RH? And if so, maybe there is no need to kind of invest into another CI.
I think there's some elements of it that may need to be discussed. So like the Fedora, the CoreOS pipeline tools should be pretty easy. The Fedora CoreOS team already has many of those elements. The bits of it, so it's kind of like Fedora CoreOS is like just one component. The vast majority of the rest of the components are just very simple Docker images on top of a base image. And so I think we're pretty close. There'll be a few in there. So for instance, things like some of the components actually use a lot more RPM content. Maybe 90% of the images in OpenShift have 0 extra RPMs. There may be some others that require a little bit more work to have a Fedora equivalent. And I think those are where, as to Neil's point, like we might actually want to spend some time on that so that we have good inputs, but those can kind of be like their own modularity sort of. Those are equivalent to modules because it's a specific set of things that are almost independent of CI or what we're doing today.
Okay. I'm struggling a bit to kind of see what are the next action item on this particular topic. Is it something we need to kind of put it down and discuss how we're going to do the implementation if there is any need, or we should say forget about that because we'll be on that train, so we can wrap it up and at least have all the pieces put together in the puzzle.
To be honest, I feel like I'm a very incremental kind of person. I think we could very easily get to the point where we have a Fedora CoreOS and do the basic minimum integration. I think as Ben and Christian have kind of like talked about with Colin and others, do that bare minimum integration, and then as we're getting close to that, have the discussion about, we might have a phase 0 prototype that has some wrinkles that we're not happy with, and then in phase 1 or phase 2, get the release tooling, evolve the release tooling however we need and however it needs to be opened up to make it easy for that, as well as consider, maybe we should rewrite it all from scratch in Bash or something.
Okay. Yes.
All right, I heard that no Bash note. So we're almost at the end of the hour. I'm cognizant of everybody's times and everybody's schedules, including my own. And I do have the survey results in, as I said earlier, they are mostly about logistics for timings of things. And what people had said really was biweekly would be good. It looks like for the majority of people at the moment, this time zone or maybe an hour or two earlier would work. I'm fine. I'm on the West Coast. I get hit on us all the time. Would work. Again, I will send some note to the mailing list about a proposed time. So maybe a little earlier than this on Wednesday. It looked like it really didn't. There was no serious winner for a day of the week. And for me, earlier is always better in weekdays. But I'll send a note to the mailing list around that, and I'm going to propose something in 2 weeks' time. to the group. And the other thing I just added into the bottom, and please feel free, the date for the Ignition deep dive is August 28th at 9 a.m. Pacific. As you can see, that's why I don't like 9 a.m. Pacific for this meeting, because that's when I do my briefings. And we'll do this via mailing list. And I'm going to share my screen so you can see what I'm looking at. There, complete. And we will, through the mailing list, will Ben and Colin and probably myself will hook up on the trade-off choices doc development and probably set up a meeting to do that. The only thing I'm going to say to everybody right now is I'm on vacation next week and the week after, so you may be doing some of this on your own, but I will stage you nicely. And Ben and Diane and Sanja will, I think somebody else volunteered for working on the charter. Let me just look at the notes here. Anyone else? And Danny. We'll do that, but we'll try and do that as much via email threads and then share the documents in a Google group folder that is public for now, and then figure out where to host this stuff once we have first drafts in the OKD repo. So that's probably another task to take on. Is 2 weeks time sound good for everybody here who's still on the call and hasn't dropped off? Is there any objection 2 weeks from now?
Good.
Okay, that works for me. I'll be kind of away for the next 2 weeks, so that works fine.
Okay, so cool. So thank you all again for coming, for Danny, for Tim, for John and Neil and everybody who's not from Red Hat. It is greatly appreciated, and we love, I don't speak for Red Hat, and we love that you're here and in this conversation. And if you have other people that we can invite, or we should, please do. And again, if you can join the OKD working group mailing list, we promised it's not another marketing list. It is specifically for working group conversations. And the OpenShift dev and OpenShift users is still going to be there for mailing lists for people to use. So use that to continue the conversations you're having, but the stuff around voting and documents and meeting announcements we'll try and do on the OKD working group and decision making there. So there you go. Wow, we did it in 2 minutes over. So thank you all, and I will post the recording first along with the links to the notes, and we'll be going for it. I probably will also post the notes to the OpenShift dev and user and the Fedora CoreOS mailing list again, as I did with the announcement for this, just to keep building an audience and collaborators. So thanks.
Yes.
Take care, guys.
Everyone.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank y'all.
Thank you. Now we will all jump to our next meetings.